Welcome back, everybody, to our first call in 2026 for the AU Patient Summary FHIR IG. We're really counting down now to the ballot for working standards, so we're about done our development, and we're doing some of the last parts today and in our fortnightly call next week, and then we're basically going out to ballot. What I wanted to start with is an acknowledgement of country and that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And we acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators, and healers.
Is anyone else hearing Danielle? Apologies if I'm interrupting.
That's okay.
No,
It's a good
that's okay.
question.
I
Can
can hear
anyone
you.
hear me?
I can hear you, Danielle.
Me
Yeah,
too.
okay.
I can hear you as well. I've responded already. Might just be a Philip issue.
It might be. Have someone put that in the chat for Philip? Uh, thanks, Heath. Um, it's Philip issue. Um, in terms of meeting etiquette, I'm just going to remind people in our first call back in 2026 that what we want to have people do when they sign into Zoom is have your name and in brackets the organization, and that helps us do the meeting minutes and attendees so that we understand like who's there and in terms of coverage. If you don't use Zoom very often, what you can do when you've already signed in is rename yourself. So you have that opportunity to do that after you click participants and use the ellipse next to your currently signed in name to make that edit. What we will do as we go through is raise your hand using Zoom reactions in order to ask a question. You can ask a question at any time. Uh, there, we don't like leave things to the end. What you can also do if you don't have Zoom reactions available to you, but you have the chat, you can pop something in the chat. Or if you've dialed in using your phone, you can just like, say your name and ask your question. Um, all our meetings are recorded. Um, and these are recorded and put on YouTube. This is part of the standards process. There's a transcript from this. We have minutes, and the chat log is also captured and is put on the minutes page. If you feel free to use the chat log and post questions, and certainly links will come up throughout that. But if it's something that we need to be talking about in the meeting, it's preferred that you also put your hand up so that we can actually include that as part of the discussion. It gets recorded. As chair, I will refer back to the chat, but I won't be monitoring it closely. So I won't always have a timely kind of question response if you're just putting it in the chat. Um, let's go through the agenda for today. So here's what's proposed. Our usual business that we do in terms of approval of minutes, updates, and news. There's quite a lot of updates. Go through a bit of a ballot update, which is our ballot for comment from Patient Summary. Then we have 3 change requests for Patient Summary. That have been tabled. 2 of those are from the last call, and one of them's a new one related to our final data element from AUCDI that is a patient summary use case in AUCDI that we have had a TBD mapping. So there's a proposal put forward today to go through that and map that. Lastly, we'll talk about if we have any time, and we might not, we'll have a brief bit on going to ballot for working standard, but really focus on what's next, because this call is also going to be like a last call for changes. We have one more meeting after this one to process any changes that people would like considered before we put out our baseline as the proposed working standard for R1 for patient summary in Australia. So, actually, before I move on, are there any other items that people would like to add to the agenda today? All right, I'm not hearing anything. If something occurs to you later or you'd like to add something to next meeting's agenda, feel free to pop your hand up, and we can make sure we capture that. Okay, usual business. So, approval of minutes. It's been a while. So, our last meeting was the 19th of December, which is really just after the Connectathon. These were sent around for review. So, I'm just going to do a quick run through for these. So, what we've sent round for review, it has the attendees, we have our slides, we have the recording, the transcript, the chat log. We've got a detailed kind of summary of what happened there, including any decisions. Um, the focus of this meeting was a report back, really from Connectathon, which was a very successful Connectathon. And in particular, the breakouts, I think, have formed a lot of what is going to be talked about today in terms of changing some of or clarifying some of what does must support mean for patient summary. So I'll just do a quick roll through for these. That's what that looks like. Now, does anybody need any more? Oh, I can tick that because I've actually done that action. Tick. Okay. Does anybody need any more time to review these, or are we happy to? If not, then I'll ask if someone's happy to make a motion. All right, not hearing anything. Is someone happy to motion approval of the minutes from the 19th of December?
Move to approve.
Sorry?
Move to approve.
Thank you. Who is happy to second?
Happy to second that, Ricardo.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'll now find the electronic poll. Okay. You should see just coming up in front of you the electronic poll to approve the minutes of our last meeting, which was on the 19th of December. Please vote affirmative, negative, or abstain. If you don't have access to the electronic vote, you can use the chat to put a +1 and then either affirmative, negative, or abstain. And if you have dialed in, you can say your name and whether you are affirmative, negative, or abstain. Now, only 70% of people have voted, so we're just waiting for a few more. All right, I can see one in the chat, but we're still waiting for a few more people to click affirmative, negative, or abstain. All right, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll and share the results. With what's in the chat, that comes to 11 affirmative, 0 negative, 12 abstain, and the motion carries. I'll also do what you will see are percentages. As the chair who's started the poll, I have greater Zoom permissions, and so I actually get to see all the detailed numbers. That's what I'm reading out for the purpose of the minutes. Okay. Let's move on to our next item. Okay, so updates and news. So the current set of AU Core TDG co-chairs, because the Patient Summary project is a project that's being run underneath the AU Core TDG. So the co-chairs for the AU Core TDG are the co-chairs for this project. The current set of co-chairs had their official term end in December 2025, so last year. Um, there was expected to be some elections prior to that. They haven't been held, obviously. So what has happened or what is happening is that there is the TDG voted in the main call yesterday to continue with the current arrangements in interim until we have the advice from HL7AU board. Elections are expected to happen in the first quarter of 2026. So in the next few months, we should have more information on what is happening around co-chair elections and any other changes around work groups. AU Base is published, so that's the release that we're going to rely on for our ballot. Both AU Base and AU Core and e-requesting are all getting published in the next couple of weeks, so Base has already happened. AU Core went for publication approval requirements yesterday in the AU Core TDG. It's met those. The AU Core TDG was happy for that to go to the FHIR work group. So next Wednesday, that will be taken to the FHIR work group for publication approval. And if approved, then it will get published next Wednesday. Patient summaries, I think a fortnight or so after that. We've got a timeline slide towards the end around our deadlines that we're working to. The next update is about the work group meeting connectathon. So we had a connectathon in December in Melbourne. The next one's in Sydney in March. We have the dates. So that is March 10th to 12th. The first day, March 10, is going to be a work group meeting. The last couple of years, it's been a symposium and work group meeting, but this year it's only going to be a work group meeting. It's got a plus next to it because I think also there will be some sessions run by board members to do some engagement around some of the changes coming related to the governance and operation of HL7AU. Those changes will impact us. There's a proposal that significantly kind of changes not having TDGs anymore and moving into a work group space. So if you're going to be there, it's absolutely worth coming along. And then we have the March Connectathon 11 to 12 that will have a patient summary track there. The 11th to 12th is when we're going to try to complete testing, basically, of patient summary, because that will be the draft that we are putting out for working standard and saying, look, this is it. This is what we think it is. And so we're going to test that in that connectathon. The tickets aren't out yet. The tickets will be out soon. My last conversation with Robbie, HL7AU board member, was that that would be likely the end of this week. I know that's kind of today, so hopefully today, and if not, hopefully early next week. That's all I have to say about those updates. I think we've got a few more around ballot sign up. Okay, so ballot sign up. Brett, if you can't speak, I'm happy to talk to this one. All right. So ballot sign up. So patient summary, ballot for working standard. The sign up is out now. That closes on the 13th of Feb, so I think that's 2 weeks away. And that is essentially voting on and providing comment on the work that we've been doing over the last year and a bit to move forward into publication of a working standard. So for all the people on the line, I would encourage you, if you are eligible to be a ballot voter, to sign up to that. There is an eligibility. You do need to be a HL7AU member, either as an individual or as a member organization. You can, I think, also sort out some membership details with HL7AU to ensure that you are eligible. But the ballot sign up is here. If you're having any problems with that, you can contact Brett Essler and there's further information on the Confluence page if there are any issues with sign up. Does anyone have any other updates or news that they want to, they either want me to speak to because I've missed it, or they want to provide before we go into the rest of the agenda? All right, let's move on. So, IPS update. Now, this should be you, Heath. Did you want me to keep sharing screen, or would you like to share screen?
No, that's fine. Just the next slide. Okay, so as you probably know by now, we have some IPS. So this is the HL7 sort of international group IPS project call that have weekly calls. We've been able to negotiate one a fortnight that is in a friendly time for us at 9 o'clock on Sydney, Melbourne time. And since our last AUPS call, we've had 3 of these calls on the 24th of December, 7th of January, and the 21st of January this week. So the next point, please. We've been primarily talking about this particular ticket that I raised as a result of the clarification issue from the AUPS ballot to provide additional guidance around must support obligations when an element has multiple cardinalities. And so in those discussions, we've sort of had some examples that we've been working through to try and understand what the expectations are of systems populating these and handling things like patient identifiers, whether and sort of the discussions we've had is that ideally we want to be able to populate at least one known identifier. And in cases of an international IPS, which identifier types do we handle? And so in those particular cases, we want to be able to accept all of the identifiers that are provided, but have the ability just to use the ones that we want. And then we sort of look at other scenarios like allergy intolerance reactions. We feel that, you should actually provide every reaction that's in those particular cases, because there's potentially some clinical impacts if the record is not full, but then systems may have some limitations on the number that they're able to use or store, for example. And similarly, things with allergy intolerance codes around which terminologies do we use? Is it SNOMED core codes that we're using? And again, similar, which in an international scenario, which ones we support. So that we've worked through those, and from a project perspective, we actually came up with a proposal, or I proposed to the project that we have some guidance around the idea that there should be they shall populate at least one known, but there's also this relevancy issues around is it relevant for this particular use of an IPS? So we introduced that idea of relevance in the context of shall populate if known. But on the consumer side, we've still felt that there needed to be all occurrences to be handled. Whether you use them all, that's part of evaluating the handling of these, and we'll go into that a little bit later on. So just the next point, please. So basically, the IPS agreed in principle with these requirements, but and we initiated some guidance from the Fire Infrastructure Working Group. So they're the ones that own the concept of obligations and must support, and the profile definitions, etc. And they've basically made a recommendation that we use a new obligation extension called applicable number to support the concept of at least one. So that's one thing that we're looking at. And also, they've given us some indication that we can't redefine the meaning of the obligation codes. And if we've got more requirements around softening obligations to deal with context and relevancy, then we may need to consider a new obligation code. So that's the quick update around that. But other than the fact that this is an ongoing saga, and we will be considering the use of this obligation at the IPS level, and also considering whether we need some additional obligation codes to be added. So that's ongoing work. Thank you.
Thanks, Heath. I'll do a really quick ballot update. In exciting news, we went through all of those states. So we did publish the ballot resolution snapshot. We took it to the Connectathon, got it tested. That went really well. Um, Out of the last ballot, a number of people withdrew their negatives. So we have got a shockingly high score of 97% of approval. It doesn't count because it was ballot for comment. But, imagine if that was ballot for working standard. That's lovely. All of that kind of ties into the fact that the work we've been doing is I think really quite consistent in terms of the testing and the feedback that's coming through. That we are in, I think, what is the sweet spot for the R1 release in terms of its content. And we have finished all of the application of the ballot issues. So we are ready to do our last call final changes and go into the ballot for working standard, which is hopefully really more of almost a tick and flick to say that, yes, this actually does constitute the set of content that we are happy to approve as the baseline for the working standard for R1. Now, let's go through those last change requests. So we have 3 for today. These are the only 3 currently open on Patient Summary. The first one is around AUCDI mapping. That is with Brett. But Brett, are you available to go through this? Yep.
Yeah, I'm good to go now.
Oh, you are? Okay. Did you want to share screen?
That might be easier.
All right, I will. Hang on,
Let
let me just stop
me.
sharing so that you can. Okay.
It's uh, okay. All right. So I'm just going to run through this. Hopefully you can see a slide, maybe not in presentation mode.
We can see it not in presentation mode.
Yeah. Is that big enough? Because let's try that.
It's okay for me.
Yeah. I'll talk through it anyway. Yeah, so what we're talking about is our AUCDI mapping table. So we do have a definition defined in AUCDI R2 as a concept for first reaction date, onset of first reaction. So we have a spot in the spec where we do mappings to CDI and explain what the FHIR representation of that is, and we need to have a look and see if we can populate this concept with the mapping. So I'll just kind of show where that is. So at the moment we don't have a particular mapping for date time of onset for first reaction. There's a bit of narrative here about different approaches, but I'll walk through the feedback received on these and a proposal on how to go ahead we can discuss. So the feedback from a few system implementers in various settings was that generally speaking, there's not a lot of recording of specific first reaction date times. That may be true in some settings, but not so much generally. We often get this initial onset information from the patient themselves, so that's essentially history recording, which may be many types of concepts, including the first reaction date, the diagnosis or date, if there's actually a formal diagnosis, and some other assertion of knowing that the condition exists. So it's generally speaking not explicit in its nature. So So this is partially like how systems record this, and I think it varies obviously with setting. I think in an allergist system, it's recorded maybe differently, but in a GP setting or even in a hospital setting, a lot of these things are recorded as reported kind of information. So to try and summarize that in terms of the fire elements we have available, um, we already have a must support on onset, allergy intolerance onset. Uh, I'll get AUCORE up. Uh, the so it's probably worth looking at what we currently have in our profile. Oh, I should go to patient summary. That's where I am today.
Just put the link to the patient summary allergy intolerance detailed thing in the
Yeah.
chat.
Do that. We can review. Okay, so we inherit AU core as part of what we do, plus any extra constraints. So around onset, we do have obligations around onset, and there is a must support defined on onset date time, which we've inherited from IPS, I think. Yeah, so that's the one we definitely have um, obligations around. Down in allergy intolerance, there's a reaction recording as well, which is specific reactions that are reaction events that are recorded. So effectively, that is the first reaction date would get recorded in that space. We don't have any obligations on dates in that background element there. So at the moment, there's no obligation to populate a date around the reaction event recording at all. So that's just worth noting. So yeah, so looking at the different onsets here, we have an overall onset, which lives at the top of the allergy intolerance entry, and we have one or more, zero or more reactions able to be recorded, and they have a specific onset date too, which is linked to the event itself. So looking at the CDI definition, so essentially this is kind of recording that. So we have this top level onset date time. Um, it's practically used for various kinds of recorded dates, including a reported, confirmed diagnosis, or other sort of date of assertion. And we have specific reaction dates. So we can have any or all of the reactions recorded in the allergy intolerance reaction element, background element, and the dates are recorded in onset. So that could be the first reaction date. But notably, there is no specific indication in those reaction recordings, expression of the reaction in terms of whether it's the first, last, or any other reaction assertion. So really, you get a list of reactions, and you can't tell if they're the first, last. They're just the ones you know. Um, so yeah, and notably too, I think there is some stuff coming in AUCDI R3 around the last reaction date, and that kind of relies on you having complete knowledge to know it's the last one. Um, so I think there's basically these two elements that are of interest. There's the top level onset date, onset X, which includes a date time, and there's also the specific reaction event onset, which is the event date recording. So is that okay with everyone? They're the things we have. Yeah, cool. So yeah, to kind of round this out, I have a proposal, but I think we obviously need to discuss um, whether it's a decent mapping, but also if it has any impact. which might come out invalid anyway in terms of our kind of must support requirements. So basically, yeah, to go and populate the CDI page, I proposed some words. So basically, I think the appropriate place to record the date time of onset of the first reaction is actually in the reaction backbone element, because that is essentially, I think, a direct map of the concept that's defined in CDI. But then I've kind of qualified that with a couple of points to try and make it clearer as to what to do and not to do in that element. So just to kind of, so I'll let people read it, but yeah, the things to kind of note, in the comment are, you can record the onset date of any or all of the reactions that are known. There's no specific indicator or assertion of being the first actual patient reaction event, and consumers of the information can only reliably consider the earliest reaction onset date as the first known reaction event. Systems don't necessarily have complete information, and there is still, I think, some variability in whether we know that's reported or an actual like official confirmed reaction event. So, and I think, I don't know whether we need words around patient reported kind of concepts as well, because they come with some kind of ways of considering those differently. The other thing to add was I did add a point about the kind of use of the onset X data there is, which includes onset date time, is it's basically an assertion of the allergy being present. And I've kind of qualified it completely to say includes confirmed or reported diagnosed condition date, and confirmed or reported first reaction date or another date asserting the existence of the condition. So it's yeah, so this is, yeah, where we land. So Danielle.
So I think I think this is interesting in a couple of ways. I uh, to a degree, and I'd love to hear from people on the line whose systems capture this kind of information, because I'm assuming that if you had to try to pluck out a date of first reaction, that would be a derived value. Like you're not actually storing something in a specific field that is like first reaction date. Uh, uh, that's probably what I'm thinking happens. And to a degree, we've already got my support on allergy intolerance onset, and onset's definition is uh, relatively similar. Obviously, you can work things through in terms of reaction dates, but if the allergy intolerance onset is the estimated or actual like date when it was identified, I agree. I guess we could argue between, it turns out I had a reaction, but it wasn't understood as an allergy, in which case I guess you could record an earlier reaction than an onset, but I don't actually think that's how the FHIR resource would be expected to work. I don't think you would expect to have an earlier reaction onset than you would for the allergy intolerance dot reaction, if if that was kind of clear in that relationship. Um, and I'll hand over to Heather, I think, who'll
Yeah.
have some awesome insights about the clinical kind of side of that.
Look, I just wanted to, yeah, thanks for inviting us to talk about it. It's a messy data element. There's no doubt about it. It's not something that's intended to be precise, because clinically it's messy, but also seen to be clinically valuable, especially when you don't have a full record. And just getting a sense of how long has this been an issue is really what we're trying to do. So Brett pointed to the allergy intolerance onset at that top level, and when I went back to the original archetype and found the change request, it was pointing exactly to that. It was 2023 when it was added to the archetype because of changes in R4. And it was pointing to that particular link and this particular onset in the FHIR IG at the time. So I see a direct correlation, and this was our clinical response to FHIR adding that to the resource. So I guess we've defined it from a slightly more clinical point of view, saying it's the onset, given that you can have some reactions that last for weeks or months. Therefore, we're actually just saying this is the big when it started. So it's not actually so knotted up in it being the start date so much as this is really when it happened, and assuming that most of them are actually, the end date will be very close to the onset date, but it matches the onset of other dates and so on as well. I think it also is just reflecting the messiness of issues of patients reporting stuff. I mean, you can't, anything that's entered in a record is either known because you observe it or it's patient reported, and it's up to the clinician to determine whether that's got credibility or not. And that depends on the clinician. And so all of this is, always going to be messy, and it may need to be updated over time. But if you've got an incomplete record and you haven't got all the reaction events, so we're looking at, historical reactions, this is going to be potentially an approximation, but what it's doing is giving the clinicians some sense of how long they've had this reaction. Is it recent or is it not? And if the concurrent one that's coming through AUCDI R3 being the last one is absolutely being promoted by the allergy specialists because they want to know how recent the last one was. And so that's always going to need to be updated as you get new reactions coming through, etc. So it's going to be a dynamic couple of data elements that's really giving you that overview. But it's definitely pointing to exactly this data, this attribute in the FHIR IG that Brett's pointing to. So totally agree with that. It's just, I guess, worded slightly more clinically. But you're being a lot more precise in how you think this should be defined. And I think that's tricky. And that may be what's tripping people up. I think it's seen as an indicative kind of data element rather than actual fact. If we can get the facts, that's great. But I think the reality is it's often just a best guess of somebody who had their first reaction when they were 5 and they're currently 80, that kind of thing. As our records get better, obviously that's going to become a one-to-one thing, and you can directly derive as you enter a new reaction event and the manifestation, etc. You will update this root level onsets as well as relevant. Is there any questions about that? Does it help or does it confuse?
No, I think that
Yeah.
I think that was a good summary, and also how some of the other dates or some of the dates that would be capture and reaction could be used in other particular circumstances, and that what has come out of that change request is pointing towards allergy intolerance dot onset, which is what you've popped in the chat, which is probably also where I was thinking.
Yep. And in the archetype, we've got all of the various ways of representing that as well, which is consistent with the way it is in the FHIR IG.
Yep.
So you would just roll up that first reaction date into that element, into the
That's
top
my
level,
assumption. Yeah.
or do you want, or keep it at a specific reaction level?
You would roll
Just
it
because there's
up.
two. Yeah, I think it's an interpretation issue because I think systems, like the patient will say, you'll like in a GP setting, you'll say, "What's your allergies?" They'll go, "I have allergy to latex." When was that started? Oh, 2003. That's about as good as you'll get, right? And it's not actually a reaction recording, right? As such, like so, it may be the diagnosis, it may be just somebody said you've got a reaction. There's all those things.
Yep.
Yeah.
I see Matt's hand
And
up. Well, yeah, sorry.
no, no, thank you. And Matt, you've got your hand up.
We can't hear you if you're talking.
No, we can't hear you, Matt.
Play with your audio. Come back. No, still no.
Yeah.
We'll let you.
Maybe
Can you hear me now?
end and
Yep, can
rejoin, and
No,
that might
got-
fix it,
we
and
got
then
it now.
we'll. Yep.
We got him. We
That's
can
right.
hear
I
him.
changed mics for some
cool.
reason. My headset's
Awesome.
not working.
Yep. Good.
Yeah. Look, thanks, Heather. Thanks, Heather. That you actually went into some of the questions that I had around this as well. It's an interesting one, right? Like if we look at the documentation around what this is, and I think the confidence level about was it patient reported versus clinically observed, isn't there an element in here that there should actually be some sort of codification around how that was reported? Because the biggest fear I'd have with this, especially with like new startups, etc., building off the FHIR implementation, if they're assuming this is always gospel, but it's potentially not in the first instance, are we going to have decisions being driven out of these elements being returned because it's assumed it's 100% correct? That's the clinical concern that I would have in here, because as we said, it's not black and white right now. And is there something that we should be considering in here, either as a warning in the documentation, in the implementation guide around this can be derived or patient reported and may not actually be a clinical observation, and just to use with caution depending on how you're trying to build it into workflows. That was my question and just concern, because I mean, otherwise you end up in a position where you start to get in the same path we've had with HL7, right? Where some systems can decide this is the only way and this is how I'm going to use it, but the system on the other end isn't quite using it there, and because it's in that grey area, depending on how we've stated this observation. But that was just going to be my feedback question. Is there any, do we use these verification statuses, for example, but on that specific onset one, to say how was that reported and how trusted can it be?
So there isn't an easy link for how. The verification status is must support in core and patient summary. So I think the status provides an annotation on the degree to which you can say whether or not this has actually been clinically verified. So patient reported, for example, I would expect a system to say unconfirmed. And we would only see things coming out of maybe allergy tests to actually switch that to be like confirmed. This is actually a confirmed allergy. What we don't have is an element or any way to record, I guess, what the particular investigation was undertaken, like directly from the allergy. If it's in a broader context, you can probably link the allergy as coming out of like an encounter where that occurred. But in terms of, I guess, the context of this specification, which is a patient summary, we wouldn't really expect to see that kind of detail coming through anyway, because it's a summary extract from a system. I think it's an important one to consider for some of the wider content, and I think there's some open air models that also look at how to link that through. I think we should go to Michael. I think you might have a comment on this.
Thanks, Danielle. Look, I think what we've got to remember here is that this is patient summary information, and it's meant to give the clinician summary information in regards to the patient. So you take that obviously with an appropriate grain of salt when you're got the patient in front of you. If we start adding a whole range of other things, and this is what I'm worried about, is that we actually make it so complex that it doesn't actually become a patient summary. It becomes a mass of information. No one's going to use it. So it's always the balance between giving you absolutely everything, and it then becomes reams of paper or reams of screens, and no clinician's going to use it. Or, sorry, there will be ones that do, but the majority won't, because it'll be unusable. And that's always the risk. So what we've got to be able to do is say, it's information, it's informing what I have the patient in front of me, and I trust or utilize that information based on what clinical decisions I'm making as that clinician. And that's, I think, I don't expect that we will be using, it's a patient summary data. If a startup's trying to use this to actually create a system that makes a decision, then that's not the use of what this is. This is summary information for individuals. So I think we've got to be, remember the context of what we've got here. Otherwise, what I keep worrying about this, and Daniel's heard me, go on and on about it, is that we end up putting absolutely everything in here, and it just becomes so complex that no one uses it, and that's my worry.
No, and I guess that's where I'm coming from, Michael. Right? Like
Yeah.
if I look at this and I've seen this in the DICOM world heaps, right? Like you've got startups coming along that don't understand DICOM.
Yes.
But my concern is we're out there advertising FHIR. This is the way of the future, exchange the data. But then if you get a startup come along and build some sort of AI agent model that's pulling this patient summary and then summarizing again on top of the output from this, but they
well, hopefully the TGA will get them, so that might.
I'd hope so. I'm cynical at this stage, but I mean, this is more where I'm going. Do we need to have something in the documentation explaining it? Doesn't mean we have to add extra elements, but do we have to at least document what this is? Because you're right. If you're in front of the doctor and the doctor's reading the summary, then they will use their human brain to interpret and take things with grains of salt about this is a summary from another place. Do I trust it? Do I not? And they can assess that way. I'm more thinking about where we seem to be going with automated systems and AI agents and models, and where all the hype factor is right now, where this could go off the rails. And I guess that's the risk I see with it as well, if we don't explain it.
It's about, I think, maturity. And, I think, one of the important things about this is that this is at a point in time that we are, based on what we know and the, imperfection that we have in our systems today, we have to make a decision point. Over time, we may change and adapt that as things improve. And I think that's the beautiful thing about what we're going through is why we ballot what we do with other stuff as well, and why we have these conversations. So, I think that's where we've got to, it is that balance. Sorry, I've spoken too much.
No, I think it was a really good discussion that also is relevant to some of what Brett and what Heather has been talking about the kind of information we can capture and share and the degree of confidence we can have in it and that kind of context. I think it's all related. And so I'll go to Heather.
Look, just extending what Michael said, basically, I mean, AUCDI and the open air archetypes are also intended for EHR storage, etc. So I don't see actually it's any different in the summary, except you're wanting to minimize the amount. But we don't have that kind of documentation in open air for any of the things, because if you do it for one data element, you have to do it for every single one of them. And that becomes just unwieldy and useless, basically. I started, what I said before, saying that this is really messy, and often it is. This is the art of clinical practice, is listening to a patient and actually saying, is this good? Is this valid? Is this not? Do I need to do more investigation? And, you are being a detective before you put something like this in, usually. But that said, there are, I've worked in practices where I work with clinicians who put absolute rubbish in, and it's like, there is no way that this is a fact. This is lazy documentation. And if you talk to the patient, like ePatient Dave and others who are becoming more empowered, they know exactly what their history is, and they're much more accurate than any of our electronic health records. So I think we can't make assumptions that a clinician entered data is more valid than a patient reported one. It is something where there is an art of medicine of how we do this. And that's why this propensity at the top of this FHIR resource and the archetype, because remember they went through concurrent reviews in 2016 and that clinical content was almost identical at the end of those reviews. It was looking at if we look at all the events that are giving us the evidence, like some of them will say certain manifestations, some might say there's no manifestation, which means you have to actually question, is the substance right, and so on. So this is an evolving documentation that's dynamic, and actually we need to be thinking of this as something that is evolving over time as the best known source of truth for any of those data elements. Things like the verification status helps if you've got particular criteria, and I think we should be leaning more on the what's the college acronym? I've forgotten. Our College of Allergists and Immunologists who are involved in AUCDI. We should be getting them to give us some of the best practice kind of principles to put into this kind of thing. But I don't think they'd want every data element documented by patient or patient reported or clinician, because I don't think it actually gives us any quality reference at all. It's messy, and I think this is a good approximation at the moment. This is the archetype, and the FHIR IGs are best practice as we know it. And I think, it's good. It's just this data element. I don't have to argue with Brett at all. I think his proposal is spot on with our intent. In fact, we're probably a little bit looser in our definition because we know that it's actually much messier. You're trying to define it to make it more interpretable by non-clinical people, but we haven't needed to do that with the clinicians, which is interesting. And it reflects current practice, I think.
Okay, I'll just coming back to before we go to Heath, in terms of the link that you put in the chat, Heather, is about allergy intolerance dot onset, and I think Brett's proposal was going a bit further
Yeah.
than that, and
Yeah.
saying actually it's inside individual reactions, which would require a manifestation to be supplied, which is one of the reasons I'm not necessarily
Oh,
for
sorry.
going
I thought it was.
up
I
to the
thought it was
top
the.
level.
I thought it was the top level he was proposing. Because if it's an onset of reaction, that's when the manifestation started on a reaction event, and that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it should be the element at the top level,
Cool.
not
Yeah.
the repeating lower level
Yeah.
one.
That's what I understood it to be.
Yeah.
Sorry if I misinterpreted it.
Cool. That's good.
I think Heath, maybe you were going to make that clarification because your hand is up and
Yeah,
now it's
I
gone
was
down.
confused as well because I thought Brett's was proposing one thing
Different.
and
Yeah.
Heather was
Yeah, that's
agreeing
fine.
with the other thing. So
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
cool.
in favor of onset at the allergy level,
Yeah.
So,
especially if that's the original intent from the archetype.
It
so I
absolutely
take
is. Yeah, and it's
so
in the same position in the archetype as well.
so date of first reaction, right? So it's not the date of the first manifestation of the reaction.
Well, the manifestations is a representation of it. We're lifting it up to say this is what, no matter what the manifestation was, even if the patient can't tell us when that was because it was 80
Yep.
years ago,
All
we're
right.
going to say it's approximately this kind of time. So we know it's an 80-year-old allergy. It's been a regular
Yeah,
thing that's happened, or
that's fine.
trying to give that general context. So
Cool.
you could,
Yeah.
I mean, you could say all of those things that are in the event. You could say any of those would be the onset, but we're just going to say the whole reaction itself.
Okay.
And
Heath?
Heath?
I think the short description that's on the screen at the moment for onset when allergy or intolerance was identified is a bit misleading, whereas the definition you posted in the chat earlier, which is the estimated or actual date, time, or age when the allergy or intolerance was identified. Okay, maybe it is slightly similar, but yeah, I think it's a little bit misleading, that's all.
Well,
It's certainly not like the way that Brett described it in his PowerPoint was the assertion of, and I don't think that's what the intent of onset. It's very similar to the onset of a condition, which I think is very much aligned with the idea of when do you first
That's an
think this
assertion.
occurred?
Yeah, but it's
Uh,
always an assertion because
oh,
like someone clinically is asserting the condition existed at that time and beyond.
The wording's quite nice to me. It's just saying something was identified. It's kind of loose. I like it.
Yeah, I think it's an interpretation on the consumption side that's the thing because I can't assume that is the first reaction date unless you kind of want to really link it.
you can't
Because a lot
assume that
of,
getting a
yeah.
reaction with an onset date is the first either. You can't know
Oh,
that.
but
The
yeah,
one
yeah,
at the
yeah, yeah,
top
yeah.
level has
That's what
first
I was saying in my
identified.
point.
The one
Yeah,
associated with a reaction is just when did this reaction occur? It might be
yeah,
the
yeah,
first,
yeah.
it might be the
Yeah, it
last.
says
You
that.
don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It says that in here. It's the
So
first known.
Yeah.
So
We
I
added,
think the
Yeah.
closest is the
Yeah.
cl the closest, noting there isn't an absolutely exact AUCDI element. The closest to that, and I guess that's why we have the AUCDI
Yeah.
editors here
That's
to
fine.
confirm that, whatever we map this
Cool.
to is actually still carrying forwards a reasonable mapping of that.
Yeah.
I still think the closest is that top element, and that it seems to me reasonable.
sorry, this is still looking at the reaction onset though, not the top one that's
Yeah.
highlighted.
Yeah. So let's
When we looked
I'll
at that
just
IG, it said it was when it was identified. In
Yeah,
the
that is
archetype, we
not what's on the
identified,
PowerPoint. That's what's in the actual IG is must support now. The
yeah.
current patient summary has the top level reaction onset as must support.
and
Um,
Yeah.
that's allergy intolerance dot onset,
yes,
isn't it?
that's correct.
That one, yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's fine.
in
Because
the
like
IG, in the IG, it talks
say
about when it was
yeah.
first or when it was identified.
Yeah.
Yes.
We put the word first in there because, I mean, saying it was first identified or second identified doesn't make sense. So it really is implied there that it's the first one.
And I think the use of the term assertion, like Brett, is skews that.
Right.
Like, if the patient says that they had this reaction or they've had this since they were 6 years old,
Mm.
Yeah.
that's not the assertion date from my perspective. So I just want to avoid the use of the assertion. Like that's when it was identified
Well,
by
the
the patient.
patient's, yeah, sure. The patient's
I'd say
asserting,
it's by
right?
anybody, but to say an assertion, I think has got a whole lot more clinical clout, a whole lot more, it's a
Yeah,
declaration
well, I
that
don't know
is
who.
the absolute
Yeah,
truth when we don't actually want to say that. So I agree with that.
that's
Assertion
fine.
is not a good term, I think.
Cool.
At least that's the way we're using it in AUCDI.
So we drop this back. Now, like it's more just what the definition of the CDI element says, because like it's now I mean, we are now saying onset is really about the first reaction. And we should say that, right? Onset
Can
X.
What we would do in mapping, and we can absolutely make a statement if we want to add some particular guidance around that. There's a lot of not completely exactly one-to-one. What we are trying to
Yeah,
do is say if your clinical information system has something they can identify as the first reaction onset date, you put it in this field in the allergy intolerance
yeah,
when
that's
you're
fine.
exchanging. That's
Yeah,
that's what we're saying by that mapping.
yeah, but it's more the consumption side that I'm worried about. Like if people are using that field for something else than the first reaction.
It'd be so nuanced though, because it's still the first identified date. It's so close that
Yeah.
But
Yeah, yeah.
but
It might it
this
may
is
not
my
be the first
concern.
one.
This is
Yeah,
interpretation consumption because
yeah,
otherwise, like I said, otherwise you end up in the mess of HL7 all over again, right? Like if you're not clear on this is how that's supposed to be used and it's golden,
But I do think
we
it's how it's
yeah.
supposed to be used. And certainly that's what
but
Heather has
but
said.
yeah,
Yeah, that
I think it'd be
works.
fine. I think it would make sense to populate the first reaction date in that element, sure. But
Yeah.
when you consume it, you can't assume it's the first reaction date. That's the problem.
That
The
current
only
definition
other
is
date it
just
could
missing
be,
the one word, and that is when it's first identified. All right. So if it had
True.
first
We should say
identified, then
that
it would
then.
be clear. But
But
I
it's
don't know
almost
that we
like
can
do we
redefine that.
but do we say in our context it means exactly that? And we
Well,
can then
I
reliably
think in
do
our
it. Don't
mapping we
don't
can
populate
say
with other
that.
things.
could if we wanted to.
Yeah.
I don't think it makes any difference at all for this particular element. Some others I would
Because
happily
it's
go down
more
that rabbit hole with you.
yeah, because
This
it's
one,
more if you don't know the first reaction date or have identified a first reaction date, don't populate it because you don't know.
if you don't know when this allergy was first identified, or when it was identified, then don't populate onset. That is the definition of that value. If you have a reaction
Yeah.
and you don't know if that was actually the time at which the allergy was identified, then you put that in reaction. That is not the purpose of that element. So That's probably why I don't think that this is actually an issue. The first reaction you have in your system, unless you're actually capturing that as saying this is when the allergy was identified. Like, how long have you had this? Since I was
Yeah,
7.
but it's to
That's what
Heath's point. It doesn't
goes
say
at the
first
top level.
identified. Like I can have a subsequent reaction, and then I'm sure it's
I
definitely true.
very disagree with needing to add first in front of the word
And I'm not
identified.
saying that. I'm just saying explicitly it's missing that. But I think it's so damn close that implicitly that's what it means.
Well, you can't
You
have
don't
second
have to stick the
identified.
word. Sorry, can I go, Heather?
So, I actually I'm just realizing in the development of the next R3, we have been discussing this data element. In the publication of R2, we had onset of first reaction, and a lot of the feedback was pushing back and saying it should say date time. But in actual fact, we've got the same breadth of data types that are being allowed to include age, etc. So we've been discussing reverting this back to onset of first reaction so that because the name is not aligned with the data types that are offered,
Sure.
this possibly throws a cat amongst the pigeons, or it also just, I think, helps explain there could be multiple ways to actually describe when the first thing happened, and so that we get some kind of context, and it doesn't need to be that precise as the date time, but the data element name is implying a lot more precision, and that is possibly part of the problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's fine. And I think like I'm just being devil's advocate a bit on the consumption side because I think it's is understood that that means I know this to be true from this date, right? So it's that's fine. And like I don't really care if it's first. I just know it's true.
I'll
Yeah.
make a statement that simply
Yeah.
having a field and reaction onset does in no way even come close to getting close to the semantics of this is when it was identified. It's just a reaction date. So I think
Yeah.
the putting it in
Yeah, that's
reaction
totally true.
onset
Yeah. That's kind of what this is saying. You
loses
can't assume it's
even
the
the
first.
identification part of things.
Yeah. And I think you would definitely use this field because that's when you know it to be true anyway. If it's the first, definitely think first reaction should go in allergy onset. That's true. But if you want to be explicit about an actual
If you want to be
reaction,
explicit, we create a
yeah,
custom string extension. And we do that for all these elements where we go, this is exactly what it means. And we go into Z
yeah,
segments, basically. Like if you want to go like, this is
yeah, that's fine.
exactly what it means and nothing
It's just
else.
clarifying on how you can interpret it downfield. That's the main thing is to know what it is and what it isn't. Yeah, yeah. So I think in the summary, I think this is fine, right? And it's kind of you got the message. They had an analogy from this date, so that's fine.
I
But
saw Landon put his thumbs up earlier. I just wonder whether, specifically, do you have
yeah,
this field in your system and how do you currently handle this?
yeah, cool.
No, maybe he's not on here anymore. I mean, that wasn't open to any of the vendors, but I'm like Michael or whatever, if you're aware. But
Oh, Landon,
Landon,
Yeah,
Landon's
no, sorry.
just
Off the top of my head, I can't, I'd have to have a look at it. Philip might know more in more detail, but Landon, back to you.
Sorry, I couldn't find my mic. I don't think this concept exists in BP-Prem, so we don't have the means to support it.
yeah.
Philip.
Yeah. So like I guess our screen, we have kind of a theoretical estimated date of onset of the allergy at the allergy level, not at the individual reaction. And then on that same screen, you can add in the reactions that the patient reported or that you found, et cetera, depending on whether you tested or not, blah, 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 right? But there's not a date at the reaction level that would keep getting updated or even would be explicitly set. And the date of allergy, even that, to Heather's point earlier, and I think Michael, you kind of went this way too. Like some of that may be interviewing the patient, and they're giving kind of an estimated age or year or whatever, and it may be very fuzzy, right?
Thanks, Philip. Marvin?
I'm not an expert in medical director. I've just been looking at it now, and we don't have a field that would we would populate that from. So I don't think that it's something that we'd use.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Then we can kind of just, if somebody's entered a date that they identified this condition, sure. And I think, yeah, yeah. So I'm just trying to look at some words to put in the comment. So I think everyone's kind of heading towards onset X as the place to record that identification point. So exchange of the onset of the identified allergy.
It's more of the allergy than the reaction.
Yeah.
It's
Is
the
it related?
and that's why
Yeah.
we're recording it at the top. So I think that's right.
Okay, cool. So yeah, no, this is much simplified. We're basically restating what the element definition is in some ways. So we can probably drop all of this. I don't know, I need to say anything because that's pretty much what the element definition is.
Yep.
Maybe no comment? We do that, I think.
So, I suppose coming back to this,
Yeah.
in terms of proposing content, we would propose the fire path, and I think the proposed
Yeah.
the fire, so the element that it goes into, sorry, is currently shifting towards allergy intolerance dot onset. And then the question is whether or not we would want to add a qualifying comment, which we can do through ballot. If having a look at that, we actually think that there is something further to
Yeah.
qualify. It may be worth capturing some of the ambiguity that is being discussed about what could be shared in that element. And if we could maybe put that together, I think that could be a useful comment to have in the AUCDI mapping table. Would other people be interested in that? Oh, sorry, Heather?
No, you continue with that. It's another comment.
Yeah. Is there interest on the line in adding in a qualifying comment on the kind of dates that might be shared in allergy intolerance dot onset? You can do a thumbs up or a hands up. All right, we've got a little bit of interest there, so we might see if we can formulate one, and then if not, there's also the if we don't get to that in time in ballot because the snapshot has to be frozen in a couple of weeks, then we can seek feedback from, well, everybody on the line to kind of propose a comment that we could include about the kind of dates that might be shared there. Okay.
I'm trying
Heather?
to put my, sorry, Heather's
Heath,
first.
go.
No.
No? Okay, Heather.
Just going back to that comment before about us considering changing the name back to onset of first reaction to allow the various data types to be more obvious. I'm wondering if you've got feedback as a group towards that. Or is that opening up a can of worms we don't want to go down?
I think
that kind of leads on to what my comment. I'll just put a link in the chat to our original vendor support page that we did for allergy intolerance, and there was 3 systems that indicated that they supported this element and 2 systems that indicated that they only used date time, and that was Cerner and Kyra. So, I mean, I think in principle, things like age and stuff is possible, but if we look at what our current systems are supporting, through their self-declaration, those that did that, that's what, a year or more ago.
You had to scroll down, Brett.
That's what the current systems support is date time only.
Yeah, I think there is where we have onset. Yep, that's it. That's the one. So, Only one person yeah, two said date time. Philip, I thought you said something about age. Does age? Oh, you do get age. Ah, fuzzy date. Gotcha. Fuzzy date. Okay.
Sorry,
Yeah,
I was just noticing that difference also, Danielle.
yeah,
Yeah, so we allow clinicians to enter in an age and estimated
decision.
years,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
there's several different things within the UI, but what that
yeah,
gets saved to the database as is essentially a fuzzy date.
Mhm.
And that's what we would use at interop level.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we do at least partial dates, right, in FHIR, down to the year. But yeah, I think there's extensions for other precision
Well, and you've got
stuff.
string in there, so you could say when I was in primary school or something. That may be as good as you get when
Do
you're
we
getting
have
older
string?
and
Oh,
you've got old
that's
records.
been scoped out.
Yeah,
That one we got rid of.
yeah,
Ah, okay.
I think there
Well,
was
we're not looking at
a
yeah.
that.
year we had a thing on Zulip where we were asking if anybody has done string, and nobody had. Everything else is allowed,
I think we pushed
um,
the people to
but
note
string
instead because we wanted
currently
to say
isn't.
something else. Yeah,
But
because
you see,
it's no point telling us a date if it's not in a structured
it's
format.
still clinically possible and as valid as some of the other really messy, inaccurate data. So it's some information sometimes is better than none. It gives you some context or at least something
Yeah,
you can push back on or question.
And that's fair. The position we came to wasn't that we would never allow string. The position we came to is that string is really complex to try to actually say consumers have to be able to support anything they get if and we went out to the community with a Zulip poll to say, is anyone implemented string? No one has. And so
Hmm.
we're, I think, more in a holding pattern that when a system can come and say, I am implementing string and here's why it's useful, that we can open that up in a
yeah,
considered fashion,
Fair enough.
um,
yeah. I
because of
think we
that
said
implementation
we kind of
issue.
advised to put other stuff in note because
Yeah.
note is must support. So and you can still tell people about other things, but without a structured date of some kind, like it was not, there was no point putting it in on set.
It was going to put too much
Yeah,
obligation on a consumer to be
yeah,
able to handle that string when
yeah,
they don't have somewhere in the database to put it.
You've named this onset. Date time is just one data element. We got persuaded
yeah,
to change our data element to date time when we did have this generic onset that matched the IG. We would like to think about reverting it back so it is more
yeah.
inclusive of age, period, and range.
Happy with
Um,
that. That would
That's
make
fine.
happy
We're
with
fine
that.
with that. Yeah,
Excellent. Okay, thank you.
yeah. We cover that with onset
Yep.
X. Yeah,
So
yeah,
what we're saying here, Heather, for your information, is the others are allowed,
Yeah,
but the one that you must support is the date time.
yeah, sure. And got no problem with that, but we think we should be able to have the potential in the clinical
Yep.
requirement for all of them. The date time naming has just become quite awkward and uncomfortable, and we probably
Yep.
shouldn't have conceded to that in the publication. We want to try and revert it or talk about it for a couple of things like
yeah.
that.
Cool.
Cool, thank you. Appreciate it.
I I don't want to cut discussions short, but I would just like to move that we accept allergy intolerance on ZX as the mapping for this AUCDI element at this stage, and then we'll leave the comment discussion till later.
Okay, thanks, Brett. We have a motion on the table to map the AUCDI element, which is not a date, time of onset of first reaction, to the fire element allergy intolerance dot onset X. Is there a seconder?
I'm happy to second.
Okay, thanks, Heath. There's a seconder. Now, before we go to the poll, are there any other comments or questions from people? Okay, I'm now going to move to the electronic poll. You should now see in front of you the poll, same as all the others. Please vote there. If you can't, pop it in the chat. If you've dialed in, say your name and whether you are affirmative, negative, or abstain. All right, we've got about 60% participation so far, so looking for quite a few more. And we're now at 70%. I'm not seeing anything in the chat for people who have previously used the chat. And now we're at 75%. So we still need a few other people to do affirmative, negative, or abstain, please. Okay, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll, share the results. With what is in the chat, we have 20 affirmative, 0 negative, and 4 abstain, so the motion carries. We will map that. I think there is an action to see if we can add in a meaningful qualifying statement, which would also, we would probably reach out to you, Heather, to see what we can form there prior to ballot. And if not, that would be something that we would continue through the ballot period. So congratulations, we've mapped all the AUCDI elements, which is fantastic. We are now complete with our AUCDI mapping of everything that is in the patient summary use case is now landing somewhere in an AU patient summary profile. So that's awesome. We've now got coverage.
Excellent.
So, shall we move on to the next bits? Now, I'm not going to bother to share screen because I think we're going straight to you, Heath. We've got the change requests around obligation content. Now, we've only got, I mean, this did take a while. I think it was a really good conversation to have, especially in light of some of the complications. But I think we've got 12 minutes.
Was it even worth it?
I think we could do shell handle.
Okay. I'll try and go through quickly.
Okay.
Which screen? Are you seeing presenter mode or on
Yes, you are. Thank you.
presenter mode? Or you see this
No,
one?
you're on presenter mode. Sorry.
Sorry.
I mean, it was perfect. Like you were on presenter. Oh, so we could see the slideshow.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. So there is a Jira ticket 53033, which was raised by myself during ballot. Oh no, it wasn't during ballot. It was after the fact, and actually, I think it might have been your ticket, Danielle. So add plain language description of shall handle obligation in the context of AU patient summary. So basically, it was indicated that yeah, okay. So there were some questions around what does shall handle the meaning of this element correctly actually means for consumers in practice. And this was somewhat related to an existing card, 52616, where we wanted to align the guidance around handle obligations. So it was raised as a result of that. And just to revise how handle is defined, it's basically for conformant applications to shall handle the meaning of this element correctly. And then some notes. And the first note sums up, in my opinion, the definition. It's very vague what this actually means, but that's very deliberate. But the key point is the second one, which is that if the application simply ignores this element, it's non-conformant. And then it goes on and gives an example about a status code of something like entered an error. And if they just simply ignored that, then that's potentially quite dangerous from consuming that particular record perspective. So it then goes on and says, when processing a resource, the consequences of the element need to be considered. All right. So even if you're storing it later on or etc., you really need to consider all these elements and all the values that you might receive. And again, we've got some elaboration in our IG that tries to basically describe the various scenarios where shall handle is used. And we've got statements like shall handle the composition section if present and containing any valid values for primitive elements, for complex elements. And it's just simply shall handle. And so does that guidance that we currently have in these particular scenarios around complex elements, primitive elements, and composition sections, does this provide useful guidance? And that's really what we're questioning and feel that perhaps it doesn't, and hence why we want to provide a better plain language description of what actually shall handle means. We took this to a breakout session back in December, and there was a very small group of people that had this conversation because it's a really exciting topic to talk about. So what we did was consider the definition and the intent of that particular obligation through its notes. And what we actually came out of that discussion is summarized here. So as a result, there is this proposed plain language guidance. And the first part of it is that shall handle obligation requires AUPS consumer actors to understand the meaning of the element and recognize the consequences of not using any of the element data. Ignoring an element without considering these consequences constitutes non-conformance, and during testing, this may require system providers to explain how the system uses element data and the implications of receiving values that are not supported. I've also provided an example here. So as an example, an AUPS consumer implementation that imports AUPS condition resources into a list of active problems must consider the consequences of not importing the conditions to the list when a condition with a clinical status has a value of reoccurrence, remission, and relapse. I guess why I've used this particular example is because I feel that these are just the nuances of an active. Should they go on to an active list or not? The fact that it's a reoccurrence or a remission or relapse, it's questionable, and there's some clinical debate, and I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to have that debate, but I'm thinking that they might be questionable on whether they should go onto an active problem list or not. So that's the example of considering the consequences of those particular alternate values or statuses in the case of a condition. So I guess as a motion, open to discussion, but what I'm hoping to get out of this given time is to propose that we have a new section added to the general requirements conformance page that basically articulates what I've just run through there as a new section to say, how do you understand the shall handle obligation in the context of patient summary? Danielle.
Can I ask that we don't use the words new section? Can we talk about including this information? I think there's some editorial work still to be done to prep this for ballot. And while I expect this likely would land in a new section, I would rather not fix editorial kind of aspects. I think if the motion can be around providing this clarification in the interpretation of must support and obligation, then I think that would give some wiggle room for the primary editors of the IG to work out whether that goes in a table or so forth.
Yeah. Okay. So basically you're looking more at the content, but basically it's more the vibe of this and the principles that have been outlined more so than the exact wording.
I think yes, and I think there are two things that need to be put to the community. From the breakout session, I think it was clear that plain as far as we could get in terms of plain language of what does shall handle mean was valuable.
So,
Um,
so perhaps move back to this slide then and just say basically there's some content with this kind of
yes.
wording, the bits in italics. So that would be the motion would be to add this somewhere into the IG.
Yes,
Marvin?
that's one of the yes, and I think I want to check that with the people on the line. But let's go to Marvin.
Yep, I'm seconding that. I think that would be a good thing, particularly with an example like you've done there. I think that does help.
Right. Thanks, Marvin. Brett.
Quite like the words. Just with the example, we do modifier element content in the resource definitions implies it's important as well. So I don't know if I mean, this is a good example of ignoring this would be a bad idea. But some of the elements are built in, have is modifier, which kind of indicates that those elements are important.
I
And you
think that
are
sounds like
obliged, yeah.
an additional change request to lift the content from the fire standard about is modifier into this spec.
I
Yeah, it's
think
just
Brett's
got
making more the comment that maybe this example is null and
you should
void.
do that anyway. Yeah.
Exactly.
You should do that anyway by the definition is modifier.
I don't agree with that.
I think it's still true. I think it's still true. Like we
No,
would expect
because
this.
there are other things you can do with elements that are flagged is modifier. You have no. Hmm. If it is not flagged must support and it is modifier and and you are not prepared to
Yeah,
handle it, you can totally reject the content. Whereas once it is
yeah,
flagged must support an obligation, that adds on a limitation because there is a
yeah.
must
You do
support
have to.
obligation of shall
Yeah,
handle, and that's what this is handling. Oh, sorry,
that's fine.
handling. So tautology. That's what this is trying to address. So I don't think it is the same thing.
Yeah, I think you're right, Danielle, that
Yeah,
the is
it's not
modifier is
exactly.
more of a technical thing at the sort of wire level, whereas what we're talking about here with obligations is the behavior requirements on the consumer.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. I mean, this will be true. We want people to handle this way. Yeah,
Yeah, I think they're closely related, but this is very specific about what does the obligation mean for this is modifier element.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's good because it's kind of got some good language to explain what it practically means in behavior wise. I think that's good. That's fine. I'll leave it.
Okay, so it seems like people are interested in having like endorse the previous commentary that's come through in the work from the breakout session that says that yes, a plain language explanation is useful. Um, can I also then just get a check from the people on the line? Could you pop your hand up if you think that having an explanation of what does shall handle mean, or in this kind of way is going to be a good addition into patient summary? All right, we're definitely getting a few hands up there. All right, cool. So I think that's pretty clear that we've got also the online participants saying yes, yeah, this is a good idea. So I think then the other part is that needs to just go through before we can make a motion. I know we're almost at the end, is to confirm that people are happy that this is what shall handle means.
Or even the intent, but does it help explain what shall handle means? So
Right.
Mandy's got a hand up. I'm assuming that's a comment or question.
No, I think that's just
Oh,
a
Yes,
thumbs
please.
up.
I do have a question.
Okay, go, Mandy.
Um, the examples and explanation is really good. The question that comes to my mind is that if it is a summary and it is a recurrence, it can put patients, if it's a recurrence over a period of time, to put them in the category of chronic illnesses. And raising this of further clarification to flag these people, because all the purposes of our health system is to identify chronic illnesses and manage it early. So sometimes when the reoccurrence happens in that period or a gap, and I'm not going to go into details, it's highly crucial to manage patients that can be kind of outrated or outlined and not detected. So I was wondering if this is related to that when you are talking about shall handle or not.
Yeah, and it is to some extent. It's like, but this is the kind of consideration that a system implementer needs to take into account, those sorts of clinical business rules. So, it's not something that we can actually specify. It's up to the vendor to basically, with their customers, determine what are these consequences, but they need to be considered. What are the rules around managing this? And that and again, it comes down to the fact that you can't just ignore these things. That you need to be able to explain the rationale on why you are not using that particular value, not importing that particular condition into the list when you actually receive one of those, and what's the patient safety aspects associated with it. But as a technical specification, we're not going there. It's just we're basically say you have to think about all that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Heath. Brett?
Yeah, I really quite like these words because it kind of is really more pointing at the consequences of not doing something with the data. Um, and to Neil's chat point, I think what testing would look like would be we would throw the difficult cases at the testing, and go, are you actually handling this, correctly? So I think it would take, though, it would be outside the scope of automation, probably. So but definitely we could set up test cases to exercise, a lot of different values in these elements so that we would be looking to have you explain some of that if you're not handling it well.
And I've
Thanks, Brett.
deliberately not qualified what kind of testing. I've kept it pretty open and vague, because obviously we're targeting conformance, but I'm also thinking that there could be other sort of acceptance testings, sort of at at a particular contract level, etc. So,
Yeah, it's all the possible values kind of testing because it's like we have, do you handle all the different data types? Do you handle all the different values that could appear here? That's kind of, the exercise we want to put it through.
All right, in the interest of time, do we have any other comments or questions before we look to make a motion on this? All right, I'm not hearing any. Heath, would you like to shape that motion again?
to include some additional plain language guidance, as close as possible to along these lines, into the IG on what the meaning of shall handle is.
Okay, thanks, Heath. Who would like to second that motion?
I'll second.
Okay, thanks,
I think there was
Mandy.
already a seconder, but I think Marvin seconded a while back.
Oh, he did. No, Marvin indicated that it would be useful. It wasn't an official motion.
Right.
If I've misunderstood that, apologies.
Anyway, we got two seconders,
Sure.
possibly.
We'll record Mandy in the minutes. Are there any other comments or questions while I relaunch the poll? Okay, you should see that in front of you. This is our last motion for today to vote affirmative, negative, or abstain on the inclusion of plain language text to explain shall handle. Indicative text is on screen. Okay, I'm going to count that down in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I will end that poll. So with what is in the chat, we have 16 affirmative, 0 negative, 2 abstain. The motion carries. Thank you, everyone. Just while we wrap up, if the person who's sharing the screen can keep doing so, but flick to there's a timeline slide, please. Just, yeah, there we go. Okay, last call for changes is next meeting. So if there's a change that you want to see included or discussed for potential inclusion for the working standard of R1, you need to raise that now in JIRA and let us know that we need to add it to the agenda, because our next meeting is the final one for change requests for patient summary. I'm going to go run through ballot readiness and then publish the ballot for working standard. There will then be the ballot period and there's a connectathon in there. So that's what's coming up next. If you could just flick to the next one. We've got the next face-to-face, folks, is Hobart. So 24th to the 26th of February. 24th is a clinical leadership evening. Then we've got a CDG, TDG, which is joint, which is going to be talking about really encounter record and some of the requirements we might need to bring into core around encounter record. If you do not have tickets yet, Maddie's just popped in the chat the links to that to go onto the wait list to come join us in Hobart while we explore what is this, like what is the information we want to support and share out of patient encounters. And I think that's it for the day. That's it for our first meeting back, jam-packed, but we got through 2 things. Any other comments that people would like to make or any questions before we wrap up this call? All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks very much for your time. Great to see you back in 2026. See you in a fortnight.
Thanks for all that.
Thank you.